Hey everyone, welcome to Kit's Cars. Today we're going to take a look at the new Ferrari 296 GTB and talk about how it lines up to the rest of Ferrari lineup and the competition. This week, Ferrari announced the 296 GTB and it created a lot of questions. It has some obvious SF90 influences to the design language, but it's a clear departure from the V8 sports cars from a styling perspective. Ferrari emphasized lightweight and fun to drive during the presentation and stayed away from statistics, talking about what makes a sports car fun to drive, responsiveness, sound, etc., and less about lap times and such. The obvious comparison to the other is the other twin-turbo V6 supercar that McLaren just started shipping, the Artura. Unlike the 296 GTB, the Artura is the entry-level McLaren, starting at over $100,000 less well-equipped. The Artura comes standard with power comfort seats, axle lift, soft closing doors, and home link. The Artura is certainly an interesting car. The 296 GTB, you can guarantee, has a long list of options. And guessing by the starting European price, the US pricing will likely be higher than the F8 Tributo, which should place it in the low 300,000s as a starting point. The 296 GTB curiously does slot above the F8 in its lineup with a base price starting well above it. The F8 Tributo starts at 277,000 here in the US, and I'm guessing the 296 GTB will come in at about 320,000 or so. Ferrari cautioned against considering the 296 GTB as an entry-level car, likely to distinguish it from the Artura, which is McLaren's new entry level. Well, I didn't get an invite to the reveal of the 296 GTB. I did get an invite to the Artura unveiling, and I'll share some thoughts on that later. The 296 GTB will arrive with 818 horsepower here in the US from a hybrid twin-turbo V6 powertrain. That powertrain is interesting in that it uses a 120-degree V in the V6 design, which allows for a hot the configuration of the turbos, which means the turbos will be nestled between the V of the cylinders. This should give better spool and better efficiency as the heat will be contained in the center of the motor. The Ferrari has quoted the 0 to 60 as 2.9 seconds and 0 to 200 in 7.3 seconds, which means it'll get 7.3 seconds to 124.2 miles per hour. Pretty fast. But it's the same 0 to 60 time quoted for the F8 Tributo and only half second quicker to 200 kilometers per hour, which means that the extra 90 some odd horsepower or 80 some odd horsepower doesn't buy out a huge amount of additional acceleration over the F8. This does mean the 296 GTB is a serious performer. I'm going to make the assumption that the lap times quoted involved the Assetto Fiorano package, which is an extra cost option that gives an extra 10 kilograms of downforce and saves 15 kilograms. We'll get to that more later. My initial thought was, man, how good could a V6 hybrid sound? Well, let's hear it. Well, not bad. I think it's a beautiful car with some strange caveats. That roofline is odd, and I know it's supposed to harken back to older Ferraris like a 250 LM, but the execution is just a bit odd. The front of the car looks like the SF90 and a C7 Corvette hooked up on a drunken Disney cruise and raised the offspring in hiding. The rear fender line tries to echo the wheel well and ends up looking like a cross between a bicep flex and some sort of just growth. The line between the huge side vents and the rear fender is really awkward and looks odd to me, but the Coke bottle profile of the center section looks great, and the whole car has a fairly balanced look. Even with the missteps, it's one of Ferrari's most attractive cars, but not what I'd call a stunner. The rear of the car is kind of odd and will likely look better with some context. I always find that mid-engine cars have strange proportions that look strange in photographs, but given some context of real life and other cars around them, they end up looking better. And I hope the rear end of this car does that. It's just strange to have the exhaust so featured in the center of their car, looking like a micro USB butthole plopped in the middle of the view with puckered lips. The diffuser looks nice and the taillights are unique, but couldn't they have hidden that rear camera a little better? And the front view, man, the front view is just straight up Corvette. And again, with context, I'm sure it looks a lot better and lower and sleeker and more aggressive, but it's just odd in the press photo how much that there is last generation Corvette I see in it. Weird, especially given this is a mid-engine car. To have that much of a snosh is certainly interesting. I'm not a fan of the daylight running lights being so tacked on above the intake vents as well. The trend that I've seen are such elegant integrations of daylight running lights to the headlights, and this just looks tacked on to the inside. The Assetto Fiorano package includes some extra aero frippery, the ability to buy a Lexion rear window. We'll see if we get that here in the US, and a weight loss of 15 kilograms, see if you can buy that Lexion rear window. The big things it includes for me are the Cup 2R tires and Multimatic shocks, which surely will make this car a lot faster around the track at the expense of your wallet. I've not been impressed at all with the ride quality of many cars that use the Multimatic DSSV spool valves, but Ferrari is so committed to make their cars ride well, I'd be surprised if the 296 GTB rides poorly. But come on, Ferrari, that paint job, if it looks like a duck, does it quack like one? Not the best first impression for sure. The duckbill and the rear bumper painting is certainly distinctive, but this is going to look all sorts of horrible against anything red if the trim is just yellow. And wow, it just doesn't look good. Lipstick on a pig. The press photos featured a surprisingly Spartan interior, and I guess we'll just have to see if there are options around that. Modern Ferraris have always had a particularly impressive cabin. Even my lowly California was just an occasion to sit in because the interior was so beautiful. The craftsmanship, the quality of the leather, the feel of the interior. This interior looks pretty track oriented, and hey, that's cool, but the materials look a little bit plasticky and less than inviting. This is something that hopefully you can option however you prefer, but the press photos were not super attractive, and it looks like they were trying to make this look like a McLaren after trying so hard to emphasize that it wasn't the entry level car. And that's not a great thing in this case. Ferraris have always had nicer interiors. Specs wise, yeah, the 296 GTB and the Artura share more than you might expect. The 296 GTB, despite Ferrari's talk about it being a smaller and more compact car, which admittedly it is compared to the F8, is not that small compared to the Artura. The Artura is actually smaller in every single dimension, including the critical one, weight. Except for one, the Ferrari does have a slightly shorter, I think 40 millimeter shorter wheelbase, which should translate to good turn-in, so it'll be interesting to drive both cars. However, Ferrari likes to talk about dry weight, which is great, except really, no one cares what their car weighs without fluids in it. Really, am I going to drain the oil of my DCT to see how light the car is? No, I'm not. And then curb weight on European cars is confusing too because it includes all the fuel expected to uh, be ready to drive, but it also oftentimes includes a driver and luggage as well. But I still like to see both. McLaren has a dry weight 1,393 kilograms and a DIN curb weight as 1,498 kilograms or 3,303 pounds. The 296 GTB is heavier at 1,470 kilograms dry. This probably means that the car is close to 3,600 pounds once you add fluids and everything like that. It might even be more than that. The delta from the F8 Tributo to dry to curb weight is a little over 300 pounds. So I'm guessing the Artura is similar and might even be more than that, given it probably has additional cooling fluids for the hybrid battery. This means that the Artura is a lot lighter, which is surprising based on how much Ferrari has hyped the fun to drive and lightweight and compact during the press release. Interestingly, the 296 GTB is also heavier than the F8 Tributo, but only a little bit. Neither car is that heavy, but in a world where there are so few lightweight cars left, it's tough to get excited about these cars gaining weight. They're going to have to drive really well to balance that. The biggest advantage of a hybrid turbo motor is that the electric motor can fill in the torque curve as the turbo spools up, making the car more responsive in transition. Unfortunately, this can also feel unnatural, and and transparency will be really important so that you can't feel the switch between electric to gasoline power. While I haven't driven either of these cars, I'm certainly anxious to. Ferrari tends to fill in the torque curve on the V8 twin turbo cars with an extremely aggressive throttle map. The Portofino M and the 488 GTB and the F8 Tributo all have a really aggressive throttle map where tipping into the throttle produces a nearly fully open throttle plate, which helps the turbo spools up, but can make things a little jerky until you get used to them pulling away from a stoplight. Now, I got used to this driving the Portofino M and a few stoplights, so it really wasn't that big a deal, but it is certainly noticeable. And it doesn't completely eliminate turbo lag. There are still times where you catch the twin turbo V8 cars off boost if you were too low in the RPM band, but there's a simple solution, which is don't be too low in the RPM band. McLaren just lets the turbo lag exist. It spools up quickly, but like the Ferrari, you can actually catch it off boost, but doesn't have a super aggressive throttle to try to compensate for that. The 600 LT would certainly get to a point where it was off boost and opening the throttle meant that very little additional forward progress was made. But it just added to the charm of the car, I thought, and it dealt with it fairly quickly as spool was not far away, and you could always downshift to get around that. But given this, I expect the McLaren to actually benefit more from the hybridization, but it'll really depend on which car is smoother. Both companies have experimented with hybrid cars before with the LaFerrari and the P1, and it'll be interesting to see how well that those cars' technology filters down to the lesser ones. I know I'm being a little bit of a harsh styling critic today, but the Artura is not also a particularly beautiful car. Its details are elegant, but not particularly exciting, especially the strange overbite front end. I dislike this new trend of the blacked out section of the lower front bumper. I'm looking at you, 992 GT3, and the Artura is at least glossy there so it doesn't get lost. The headlight and air vent treatment on the sides is odd and gives the front end sort of a complex engineered look that is interesting but not beautiful. I do like the almond shaped headlights, but I feel like that's let down by the exaggerated teardrops coming down from the sides of them. The middle of the car looks great to me, and I love the way the air channel for the side vent flows across the entire door, although it makes that door handle look a little goofy and a little bit disruptive to it. I still think the McLaren shape needs a rear wing to balance it out. The 296 GTB does a much better job of finishing off the rear with a ducktail lip at the rear end. The Artura has smoother haunches and the huge air intake is more elegantly added. I especially like the flying buttresses that extend down gracefully from the roof with the air channel underneath. The rear bumper treatment is purposeful and cool looking, inoffensive and aggressive, but not particularly beautiful or elegant. There's that huge uh, sort of grill looking blacked out space. The taillights are pretty neat, but that bulbous license plate holder kind of growing out of the rear end is kind of strange. The diffuser looks good and the car looks really purposeful, but I'm definitely hoping for an LT model that has a bit more of a rear wing, just like the 600 LT. The 600 LT's rear end had just the right balance of interesting details and aggression. I loved the way the rear wing tied it together and made it feel finished and balanced with the extremely aggressive arrow on the front end. But my real love for McLaren is driven by the simple fact that I actually fit. McLaren seems to have considered my exact physical dimensions, and I can get really comfortable in any of their cars. I was really sad that there are no mid-engine Ferraris that I comfortably fit in, from the 488 to the F8 to the 458 and the F430. I can drive any of them that are convertibles with the top down, but it's no fun not to be able to put the top up and still drive the car comfortably. And even then, if I drive the car with the top down, I can't see because the windshield header is stuck straight in my face. Now, more than likely, most people are not my combination of bad back and long torso, but it certainly makes me sad that I can't fit in any of the cars that Lamborghini makes, at least their sports cars. And Ferrari only makes front end cars that I fit in. Come on, Ferrari, you just need a couple more inches of additional seat adjustment. When I got into the Artura, the cavernous cabin was really nice, and the seat dropped down low, and I had plenty of room. I even found in the fixed one-piece seats that there was an adjustable lumbar support, which I thought was really nice and a great touch. To wrap up, I had no idea we'd be lamenting the loss of the twin-turbo V8 so soon after lamenting the loss of manual transmissions and naturally aspirated motors. But if you're going to add a hybrid drivetrain, I suppose makes sense to take advantage and take weight out of the gasoline motor to compensate. But it's so hard to make a V6 sound really good. Now, I think both companies will do a decent job with making their cars sound good. And you heard the 296 GTB at the beginning of this video, but neither of the cars sound as good as their predecessors, and the flat plane V8s in those cars will sorely be missed. Between the two, the Artura is a little slower, the same 0 to 60, probably because it's lighter, but it's a second slower in the 0 to 200 kilometers per hour sprint, which means that the 296 GTB has a decent amount more top end. But really, can you use 800 horsepower on the street? I don't know. Given that the Artura has a 150 horsepower deficit over the 296 GTB and is only a second slower in that sprint, says that the McLaren might be more fun to drive because it's so much lighter. We shall see. I'm looking forward to getting some seat time buying both cars at some point in the future, and it'll be interesting to see which one is more fun to drive. See you next time.